Is Pampanga really the culinary capital of the Philippines? Or is this just some self-proclaimed myth? And if it is indeed the culinary capital, does that mean that every other cuisine in the country just suck? They're just meh or simply bland? Or is there something much deeper we're actually missing? Mabuhay! Or in Kapampangan, luwid kayo. And in Bahasa Sug, salam kasilasa. Welcome to my channel. It's me, Kirby, Araullo, your friendly Pinoy historian. Before we dive in, here's the thing. The title, Culinary Capital of the Philippines, was not something that we Kapampangans gave ourselves. Unknown to many, it is a name built from centuries of recognition, by others, by outsiders. So today in this video, we're unpacking how history, geography, and colonialism came together to shape Kapampangan cuisine into one of Southeast Asia's most complex food cultures. But this is not about bragging rights, and it's definitely not about saying that one region is way better than the others. It is all about understanding the bigger picture and the deeper reasons behind the label and why it matters to so many people. Growing up in Pampanga, surrounded by Kapampangan, Tagalog, Pangasinan, Aita, and Mestizo roots in my own family, I was lucky enough to experience these incredibly rich food traditions daily. So today, I'll be speaking not just as a historian, but as a culture bearer, someone who was shaped by these cultures, raised in their kitchens, and nourished at their tables. So I first heard Pampanga being called the culinary capital of the Philippines, not from Kapampangans but from the travel shows and documentaries that my grandma loves to watch. She was then Angeles City's tourism officer in the 90s, helping uplift the community after the devastation of Mount Pinatubo. So growing up as a little kid, I saw firsthand the dedication it takes to keep our culture and traditions alive in our food, our stories, and our communities. We won't be able to cover every dish today. I mean, I have a long list of my own favorite Kapampangan dishes, especially desserts. I have a very sweet tooth. Anyways, by the end of this video, you'll see and understand why Pampanga's culinary legacy carries so much history, memory, and meaning. When you hear Pampanga, you probably picture this one small province in the middle of central Luzon. But here's the thing, unknown to many, Pampanga wasn't always that small. Historically speaking, the Kapampangan homeland used to stretch far and wide, beyond today's provincial borders. From Tondo and Manila, across the vast, fertile plains of central Luzon, and even all the way up to Casiguran Bay in Aurora. And over the centuries, colonialism split La Pampanga apart into the many provinces we know today. And this was no ordinary land. Thanks to the fertile, volcanic soil and the bounty of the Candaba Swamp, Pampanga River Delta, and Manila Bay, Kapampangans could harvest not once, not even twice, but up to 3 times a year. So while most regions usually have 1 or 2 harvest cycles per year, La Pampanga's fertile land overflowed with rice, root crops, freshwater catch, and so many more. And this abundance of food all around us shaped our culture and traditions from the very beginning. It is also important to acknowledge that our Aita communities, the first stewards of this land, also shared their deep knowledge, from smoking meats, fermenting, to sustainable farming. Unknown to many, before colonialism, Indigenous Aitas and Kapampangans shared the same motherland. And at the heart of the Kapampangan home was the dulang, a traditional low table where families gathered together to enjoy meals, share stories, and pass down traditions. The indigenous concept of home in Kapampangan is not actually the house, but the dulang. And even in the fields, farmers gathered together for salapo, unwrapping their bakal or packed lunches onto banana leaves, placed over a collective plate called tapak laid out in our dulang. Way before budol fights or kamayans became trendy, our people, our ancestors, were already eating this way, together, by hand, and side by side. So long before what we now call the Philippines even existed, the Kapampangan homeland was already thriving with abundant food and people. So, how did all that turn into power beyond the kitchen? Well, it turns out Kapampangans were not just feeding Kapampangans. Let's zoom out for a second. Our Kapampangan ancestors were not just farmers, they were the Luzones, and they were everywhere. Long before the so-called discovery of the Philippines, long before the Europeans colonized Southeast Asia, the Luzones appeared in the ancient records of places like China, Japan, Brunei, Malacca, and beyond. not just as merchants but as warrior diplomats, negotiating trade, navigating complex trade networks, and even winning battles from Siam to Sumatra. But here's the thing, they were not just trading gold or silk, they were exporting food like salted fish, fermented sauces, livestock, of course rice, and even local booze or alcohol. You know, not just snacks but food essentials. And of course, they also traded things like beeswax, deerskin, spices, and weapons. But food wasn't just a side hustle, it was the backbone of their power. Unknown to many, the Luzones had vast maritime fleets, controlling major trade routes, feeding ports, and supplying sultanates across maritime Asia. Through these networks, the Kapampangans gained enormous wealth and steady flow of spices, ingredients, and cooking methods from all over Asia. So food was not just about sustenance or survival, it was power, or what we now call soft power in global geopolitics. Think of it this way, I mean, if you could keep the ships moving and the ports well fed, you're not just a supplier, you were a major player. Kapampangan cuisine did not happen in a vacuum. Long before the Spaniards showed up on our shores, long before the so-called discovery of the Philippines, our motherland was already a crossroads for diverse cultures and cuisines. Now, contrary to popular belief, Kapampangan cuisine is not rooted in Spanish flavors. Kapampangan cuisine flourished at the crossroads of Austronesian maritime trade, sharing ingredients and flavors across Southeast Asia, East Asia, the Indian Ocean, and beyond. Coconut milk, fermented food, spice blends, and that familiar balance of salty, sweet, and sour were flowing between our shores. Thanks to the fertile land, abundant harvest, and thriving trade, Kapampangans had the wealth and the freedom to explore culinary creativity over the centuries. And ancient China played a huge role too. Soy sauce, tofu, noodles, steaming, stir-frying, and even soup making. These techniques poured straight into our kitchens. And when the Ming Dynasty closed its borders to the outside world, the Luzones were among those who secured exclusive access to Chinese trade, deepening these culinary ties even further. Through this monopoly of trade and kinship and intermarriages, these Chinese influences became part of daily life. And that is how lumpia became a favorite, how pancit became a birthday staple for long life. But these dishes were not just borrowed. They were transformed and rooted in local taste and traditions. In short, we made it our own. So by the time the Spaniards, the conquistadors, arrived, Kapampangan cuisine was not just barely developing, it was already thriving, built from centuries of trade, creativity, and taste. What do you think happens when colonizers show up and find a land abundant in food? Because Spain did not choose Pampanga as the first colonial province in Luzon just for military reasons. They also chose it because of the food. La Pampanga quickly became the colony's primary supply center, feeding Manila and beyond with rice, sugarcane, livestock, and labor. At its peak, La Pampanga supplied around 50% of the colony's food, most of the timber, and a huge share of its workforce, thousands of workers, a massive burden carried by Kapampangan communities. Unknown to many, before colonialism, Pampanga was one of the most densely populated regions in the islands. But sadly, instead of growing, that population was drained by the demands of the empire. Farmers were forced into polo y servicio, while Vandala emptied their harvest into colonial granaries like the one in Sasmuan. La Pampanga endured brutal quotas, exhausting grain seizures, and even devastating famine. And beyond the homeland, Kapampangan warriors were sent to fight in Spain's imperial ambitions across Asia and the Americas. In fact, by the 1660s, Spain actually owed the Kapampangan people over 250,000 pesos worth of supplies left unpaid, a staggering debt much larger than the entire colony's entire annual budget. To put into context, for the ordinary farmer back then, this amount was equal to 20,000 years of earnings. 20,000 years. That's how much they were taking and not paying. And when global trade expanded in the 1800s, La Pampanga quickly pivoted to exporting sugar, feeding the colonial hunger for cash crops. And sadly, small farms were overtaken by sprawling haciendas, deepening class divides. Yet even under empire, Kapampangan kitchens kept evolving, turning both hardship and prosperity into culinary traditions. Okay, let's get this one thing straight. Kapampangans were not just waiting for the colonizers to show up to teach us complexity, to teach us culinary arts. It's always been in our DNA. Centuries before Magellan, Kapampangans were already crafting sophisticated dishes that were more than just meals. They were full of meaning and memory. Incredibly rich and layered flavors did not begin with the colonizers. If you think about it, colonialism just sprinkled new seasonings. Through the global Manila Galleon trade, ingredients like cacao, peanuts, corn, and tomatoes were folded into Kapampangan flavors. And while many assume that what we now call Kapampangan tamales came from Mexico, the truth is, we already had bobotu, an indigenous Kapampangan rice dish with deep connections to the Javanese botok or bobotok in Indonesia. But of course, with colonialism, the Kapampangan bobotu naturally embraced new techniques from Latin America, evolving into what we now know as the Kapampangan tamales. But actually, to us Kapampangans, we still call it bobotu. And even soklate batirol and champurrado, now beloved breakfast staples, actually began with cacao carried across oceans. And there's a lot more of these examples, but maybe we'll save it for a future video. Kapampangan cooks made these ingredients their own, blending them into that familiar indigenous balance of sour, salty, sweet, and umami. Dishes like arobo, morcon, embutido, and afritada, and so many more became colonial hybrids, reinterpreted through local taste. In short, they were indigenized, using ingredients from all over the world. And all through that layering, the indigenous foundation of Kapampangan cooking held strong. Fermentation stayed essential. Buru, rice and fish, aged to perfection. Pindang, cured meats, deeply local. Tabaning talangka, crab fat turned into gold. And these were not just recipes, they were survival strategies. But who actually controlled the ingredients? Who controlled the land and labor? That is where the power of sugar comes in. By the 1700s and the 1800s, sugar was not just a crop, it was Pampanga's most profitable and transformative force. Kapampangan elites, aka the Principalia, who descended from pre-colonial nobility and Luzones royal houses, consolidated and steered the sugar economy, growing their wealth and access to luxury ingredients. Meanwhile, the mestizo Chinese landowners also rose in power, expanding their estates through trade and marriage alliances with the Principalia. This prosperity allowed for elaborate culinary practices to flourish, from heirloom recipes like tibok-tibok, pastillas, and San Nicolas cookies to indulgent creations like San Reval and Silvanias, sumptuous desserts born from the sweetness of the sugar economy. But it wasn't always sweet. As fortunes grew, class divides deepened. Tenant farmers and peasant workers lost their land, fell into crippling debt, and became trapped in cycles of exploitation. Yet the story was not just about greed. Many Kapampangan elites also faced persecution, while others gained favor under the same system. Many were immersed with their people. In fact, many were farmers too. Many kept traditions alive, building churches, funding festivals, preserving rituals, and passing down old family recipes. Many supported uprisings, openly or quietly, alongside everyday laborers who kept communities alive with resourceful knowledge. Through both prosperity and pain, Kapampangan culinary traditions endured, sustained by the elites adapting under pressure, ordinary families preserving old recipes in their kitchens, and everyday laborers feeding their communities. Memory and taste were kept alive at the dulang, passed down through generations, one plate at a time. When we think of food, everyone talks about the kitchen, but the real story, it begins out in the fields. Under American rule, Pampanga's economy ballooned into full-blown agribusiness. Sugar plantations expanded into industrial operations, closely tied to U.S. markets, bringing wealth to landowners but deepening inequalities. And once again, tenant farmers and peasant workers were pushed into debt and cycles of exploitation. That simmering and rising frustration sparked revolt. The Hukbalhap movement, born from the struggles of the farmers, rose from the same fields, these fertile lands. And even after World War II, promises of land reforms brought little change. I mean, sure, symbolic land reform bills were passed, but let's be honest, they were mostly just on paper. The realities remained the same. And then, in 1991, Mount Pinatubo erupted, unleashing one of the largest volcanic devastation in world history. Lahar and ash buried entire towns and sugar fields, displacing millions across central Luzon and forcing Pampanga to to pivot once again. Yet, even as plantations collapsed, Kapampangan kitchens kept simmering. Take sisig. What began as a pre-colonial sour salad was reinvented using discarded pig heads from Clark Air Base, turning scraps into survival and struggle into resilience. And by the way, I have an entire video on the fascinating history of sisig, from its indigenous roots to becoming a global favorite, so make sure to watch it after this video. So, how exactly did the knowledge survive? Let's head back inside the kitchen. Because when everything else fell apart, when land, labor, and markets all fell, Kapampangan kitchens held the line. As Pampanga faced economic hardships, Kapampangan kitchens became living archives, keeping traditions alive through instinct and daily practice. Recipes were rarely written down. They were kept alive through memory, repetition, and the hands of those who cooked them daily. Kapampangans are very meticulous when it comes to food. Flavors have to be layered. Balance has to be right. I mean, even plating matters. Presentation matters. Because traditionally, like many others in the islands, we give our best, especially to our guests. And at home, my own apu or Kapampangan grandma still makes all of these food the old way, the traditional way. Buru fermented by instinct, pindang cured by hand, tibok-tibok and aleubi stirred until your arms tell you it's ready. No timers, no measuring cups, just instinct, scent, and memory passed down. Or as my grandma always tells me, just taste it and use your eyeballs. No fancy recipes. And of course, some families had more resources to preserve our food culture and traditions. But it wasn't just them, or even the world-famous chefs. Because carinderia cooks, street vendors, home kitchens, and everyday people kept these memories alive. They carried these traditions day after day. These dishes were not just heirlooms. They were livelihood, survival, and pride. When Kapampangan dishes started becoming trending in the early 2000s to the present day, it looks like a revival, a rediscovery, a comeback. But let's be clear, if we think about it, this was not a revival. This was not a rediscovery, because these dishes never actually left. And for us Kapampangans, these dishes were never forgotten. Kapampangan dishes were never lost. They were still being served and stayed alive at home, in carinderias, street vendors, and served at town fiestas. The only thing that changed was the outside world finally noticing. So let's talk about biringi. People often call it the Kapampangan paella, but honestly, that's not even accurate because biringi is much older and pre-colonial. The Kapampangan nasing biringi is made with glutinous rice, cooked with coconut milk, turmeric, and local aromatics. The flavors of nasing biringi traces back to the ancient traditions of our Austronesian ancestors, with influences by the early trade between Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean. In fact, the Kapampangan nasing biringi is closely related to dishes like nasi biryani in Malaysia or brinji rice in India. And yes, techniques from the Spanish paella arrived later through colonialism, but they were simply blended into what we already had. And as Kapampangans migrated around the world, they carried these flavors with them across the diaspora, helping bring our food into the global spotlight, fueling what many people call a revival. But for us Kapampangans, it was simply dinner. Survival does not, always look dramatic. Sometimes it actually looks like a perfectly made tibok-tibok. In March of 2025, the President of the Philippines vetoed a bill officially recognizing Pampanga as the Culinary Capital of the Philippines, basically rejecting it despite unanimous support from Congress. The President said that there's no historical basis for this bill. Yet, as early as the 1500s, Spaniards were already praising Kapampangan cooking. By the 1800s, European and Asian royalties dined at places like La Sulipeña, calling it one of the finest cuisines in the world. And even by the 1990s, during my childhood, long before the age of social media, travel shows on TV and food writers around the world were already shining a spotlight on Pampanga's culinary legacy. So let's be honest, Pampanga's culinary legacy was never built by law. It was carefully cultivated through the centuries, not on paper but at the dulang, and in the many recipes passed down through generations. And again, these traditions did not disappear. These traditions lived on, not just through institutions or well-known chefs. I mean, we have them too, but our culinary heritage survived and thrived because of our countless culture bearers, our everyday people, from our mothers cooking at home to the street vendors, from the well-renowned chefs to our favorite cooks in the carinderia, from our farmers to the countless families who carried these recipes and memories across generations. And this brings us to the heart of it, to the bigger picture. Not just about pride, but the need for recognition and protection. Because this is not about gatekeeping, but all about genuinely celebrating and recognizing our diversity and ensuring that our cultures and identities, our traditions, are not lost, are not diminished or diluted and dissolved into this melting pot of cultures. Because if you think about it, the true beauty of the Philippines is all rooted in our people's diversity of cultures and traditions. Our motherland and our people's food is not just, some bland vanilla ice cream. It's more like our halo-halo, vibrant, colorful, and a delicious symphony of diverse flavors. But don't get me wrong, this is not just about Pampanga. For decades, people have seen Filipino food through a limited Manila-centric lens. Dishes from Pampanga and other regions were often added to the mix and get absorbed into the national story, yet often without credit or proper context. Sadly, our diversity is tokenized and countless communities left in the margins. From the islands of the Visayas to the mountains of the Cordilleras, from the Maranao kitchens to the Bicolano homes, from the Tausug shores to the Ilocano feast, every dish carries its own story of survival and flavor. Stories worth honoring and celebrating. Reclaiming our food is not about ego or gatekeeping. It's about giving credit, proper credit. It's about preserving authenticity and setting the record against misinformation and cultural appropriation. Because when we are proud of our roots, when we reclaim our food, we're not just correcting recipes, we are honoring the hands that kept them alive through the centuries. So instead of fighting over titles or who's better, why don't we make space for every dish, for every flavor, and every story that keeps our traditions alive? No matter how glamorous, a crown can never fully carry the weight of our people's shared history, our shared food and culture. But a table can, a dulang can. Now, beyond the noise and stereotypes, Kapampangan cuisine was never about being above everybody else. Kapampangan pride is not about being the best or better than the rest. And it should definitely not be about arrogance. It's all about keeping our place at the table. Because at the end of the day, we don't really need a crown or a throne. What we really need is a table, a dulang, big enough for all of us to share. Just like what our people have done for thousands of years. So what about you? What flavors shape your childhood? What dishes carry your family's memories? And how do we make space for all of these stories, for all of these flavors? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want to dig deeper and explore how Filipino food reflects our identity across different regions, make sure to check out my other video on Philippine cuisines. And if you would like to help me make more videos like this for more stories of our people's histories, cultures, and everything in between, you can support my channel through Patreon or YouTube memberships or by grabbing copies of any of my books, coloring books, ebooks, and merch in the links below. Maraming salamat po. Orin Kapampangan, dakal pong salamat kay Kongan and in Magindanawan, syukran na binal. See you next time when Tagalog kita kits and in Kapampangan, Mikitix and in Binisaya, kita ay ta.